The Ku Klux Klan and Freemasons are pawns of the Antichrist. When I say the Antichrist, I'm talking about the system, a new world order that uprooted the old world order predating the Civil War, the Industrial Revolution, the Federal Reserve Act, the National Banking Act, the abolishment of slavery, etc., etc. Okay, these events explain why these Klansmen cover their mouths and their throat with their hands. Okay, because they are bound by secrecy, which they are obligated to never reveal, or else their throats will be cut and their tongues ripped out of their mouths. Okay, the so-called white man had to move in secret societies unlike never before because 700,000 of his brothers died during the American Civil War. All right, now have secret societies always existed before the Ku Klux Klan? Yes. All right. But they became ever more bounded in secrecy the more death that came upon the earth, because the 700,000 men was a blood sacrifice to Satan. Okay, because what came after that? The Industrial Revolution. But what was the underlying purpose of the Civil War on the surface level? Well, the northern states feared that white southern nationalists who supported slavery, that they were not interested in preserving the Union, and they would eventually take over Western territories that were on the fence of becoming members of the Union or supporting the North. Okay, it was like how things are today, partisan politics. All right, slavery would make the South more powerful than the North. Okay, the Northern Union was convinced that the Southern Confederacy would use slavery to revolt and be insubordinate to the greater cause. All right, Abraham Lincoln did not oppose slavery because of morality. No, he did so because of politics. Okay, those people were not to be trusted. Talking about those who were Confederates, who supported slavery. Okay, they were doing so to empower themselves to be an independent entity outside of the United States of America. So in 1860, Abraham Lincoln won election for president. Okay, shortly before he was to take office in March of 1861, the Confederate States of America, which was newly formed, okay, they formed it in 1861, that same year, the month before Abraham Lincoln became president. Okay, these states at the time included South Carolina, Mississippi, Georgia, and Texas. Okay, those who joined the Confederacy had to resign from their Senate and House seats. What did this do? Well, it made Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party one of the most powerful apparatuses in American history, keeping in mind that the Southern Confederacy was outnumbered and could not win the Civil War by any stretch of the imagination. Okay, so once the war concluded, they would be forced to abide by all the laws that was passed since they forfeited their congressional authority to join the Confederacy. Let's take a close look at the laws that were passed by Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans to dismantle the institution of slavery for the sake of their own political gains. Okay, because Abraham Lincoln wasn't interested in becoming president of half of the states and the Union being divided. Okay, that was his motive. He wanted to be president of all of the states. Okay, because after all, it was written in the Constitution. And again, he felt like the Confederacy was being insubordinate and for political purposes just wanted to use slavery to rebel against his authority. All right, so in March of 1861, the government started imposing taxes, particularly a tariff or an import tax named after a member of the House of Representatives. Okay, his name was Justin Smith Morrill. Okay, they called it the Morrill Tariff. Okay, the government passed this to recover from federal deficits and to prompt industrialists to pay slaves to someday work in their factories. Okay, they launched an initiative to weaken Southern Confederacy and their business of slave plantations. I believe they feared the Confederacy would become so powerful that someday they would even refuse to pay taxes and claim their own sovereign union. Okay, and things like that could collapse the entire economy. Right. So Lincoln passed the Revenue Act of 1861, which was an annual income tax to help finance the Civil War. Okay, the National Bank Act was passed in 1863 and 1864 to introduce the national fiat currency, which was a major blow to slave owners in the Confederacy because their wealth was cemented in tangibles and measurements. Okay, they didn't need their wealth and possessions to be measured by the fiat money and to be tied to that system. Okay, basically, fiat currency is money that is authorized by the government, but they admit that the fiat money is only a medium of exchange that has value because the majority of people come into agreement on its value. Okay, the problem is fiat currency was originally issued as United States notes. Okay, today they are referred to as Federal Reserve notes, which is unconstitutional. Okay, but I have to get to that in another video. So the Confederate slave owners would have to win the Civil War to prevent these laws from going in effect because Lincoln and the Republicans refused to compromise on the expansion of slavery, meaning no more transportation of slaves across state lines, or something called human trafficking, even if it was done and limited to the South. Okay, Lincoln initially wanted to put an end to human trafficking of slaves, and if whites wanted to keep slaves in their homes on their property, they were welcome to do so. But Lincoln intended to go to war over federal property in those southern states, and he did not acknowledge their Confederacy as a government authority to be negotiated with. And the Confederates, they used government property to facilitate slave trade. This is where the first wave of feminism was also inaugurated because a lot of men in the North and the South went off to war, and the women entered the workforce by sewing their uniforms, their socks, their coats, etc. Also, white women were headed over plantations in the South while their husbands and sons went off to war. But the Most High put a spirit on Negroes where they started to rebel against these wicked white women. Okay, they were trying desperately to hold on to black slaves because that was their meal ticket. That was their economy. And some of them knew that Abraham Lincoln was being used to bring them into slavery under the federal banks, which were first known as central banks. So they shut down the Southern economy after the Civil War concluded because there was just way too many slave rebellions, and ultimately slavery was abolished in 1865. But the strange thing is this was around the same time as the Industrial Revolution, where former slaves would later work in those steel factories built by the Rockefellers. Okay, the synagogues of Satan would enter the picture, and now they would be able to control their wealth to where if Confederates attempted a civil war, the Federal Reserve could just freeze their bank accounts. You see that? So these white supremacists were forced to adapt to the new norm because things would just never be the same again. And today, they join these secret societies and put on a front for these right-wing extremist groups, and they shout, "Make America Great Again." But these are all smokescreens. Okay. The Ku Klux Klan and the Masonic Brotherhood, these people enter these secret societies to play ball. Okay. And by playing ball, I mean adapt to the new norm of the Antichrist system. Okay, because otherwise they would have to tell the truth and have their tongues cut off and their throats ripped open. All right. That's where they're at with that. Because they got. All right. Their wealth was confiscated through fraud and through war. All right. But anyway, that's a whole other video I got to cover. Share your thoughts in the comments and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.